Okay, the time has come for a joke. There's a midterm coming. And so probably the joke will be on the midterm. So you've got a big advantage if you tell it, because you'll remember. Anyone? Why? You're not raising a hand. Come on, someone. You all have one ready, right? No? Oh, this is really dreadful. Oh, excellent. Good.
Gotta go find it. And put it on. Yeah. What does the receptionist at a sperm bank say as clients leave?
What does the receptionist at the sperm bank say
As clients leave.
as clients are leaving? Yes. What?
Please come again.
Yeah. Okay.
Done.
That's all right. I'll tell you something about sperm banks, which is that none of them ever want any samples from men who are less than 5'11", 6 feet tall. None, right? Because none of their clients want sperm from men that aren't at least 6 feet tall. So I am sure there are no children of mine out there that I don't know anything about. But it sometimes happens that there are men who have 20, 30 children, all half sibs to each other, and occasionally they run into each other without realizing they're half sibs. Maya?
Fertility doctor, and he replaced his client's sperm with his. So there were like 200 half siblings out there that were all his children.
There are two cases of that. There's one on the West Coast out of University of California, Irvine, a doctor who, occasionally helped his clients get pregnant by giving his sperm. That became a big scandal, and his daughter was in my class and came to me in tears because it had suddenly, it wasn't human sex class, right? But whatever I was teaching then in Berkeley. And they were going to leave the country. They were leaving the United States. The other case is from the 50s in Manhattan. And, it's clear the gentleman, in that case, he wouldn't, if the father had low sperm count and therefore it wasn't likely to work, he would mix some of his own sperm with the father's. And sometimes he even told the clients that. But the important thing was, no. So the important thing was they would never know whether it was his or the husband's. And so, meaning well, but yeah, that could be consequences. Okay. How are you doing? Midterm this weekend on D2L, available starting at noon. You got to finish by Sunday midnight. Once you start whenever you want, but once you start, you got to be done in 90 minutes. There'll be 100 multiple choice questions, many of which you've seen on Kahoots. Questions about any of that? And, you're to do this work on your own. You take the exam on your own, and no, you don't get to use, web searches to help you with the answers. It is open book. You can go to the book, and even search the book, but you better know your stuff before you start, or else you're not going to get all the questions answered in the time allotted, okay? And besides, it's better to know, right? Okay. So here's one of these cases where I have to say everything at least 3 times for you to get it. And I have some advice for you, especially if this is your first time, about how you can remember all these steps. Number 1, each time I try to explain to you the logic of why that has to be what happens next, right? Number 2, find a friend who's not in the class or someone who is in the class and force yourself to explain it to them. You'll get to a certain point and you won't quite remember and what happens next, and then consult your notes. And if you do that a few times, pretty soon you'll find you'll be able to spill off this entire same sequence, even if you've never heard of it before, hopefully because it makes sense. Okay? And I keep seeing to say, explain it to your mom, right? So, or anyone. Okay. So the brain decides that it's the right time to reproduce. It's the brain, for example, that's going to decide when puberty begins, right? That's one of the decisions it's got to make. Is there enough food, etc. The brain then causes the hypothalamus to release gonadotropin releasing hormone into the base of the hypothalamus, and it travels across the pituitary stalk to reach the anterior pituitary, not the posterior pituitary. And there, the GnRH acts on cells that are there that are going to release gonadotropins. I didn't even see it. And the gonadotropins are named that because they act upon the gonads. Interesting thing, the GnRH that's released from the hypothalamus is in such teeny tiny amounts that if you take a blood sample, you will not be able to detect it. It's below the level of detection. So, because once it gets in the entire circulation, you can't find it anymore. So, if people are having fertility problems, nobody measures how their GnRH is doing. Right? But the GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary to release the gonadotropin, and you know the sequence that the gonadotropins have to do to get ovulation take place, right? First, they've got to stimulate the follicle to make it develop, and then they have to luteinize the follicle, make it turn into a yellow body. So they act on the ovary, and in response to gonadotropins, the ovary secretes its own hormones, and these are steroid hormones, about which more in a moment. In contrast, all the hormones we've been talking about so far have all been protein hormones. GnRH is a protein. It's encoded in one of the genes in your body. I know every one of you have got a good copy because here you are. And same like with gonadotropins, they are proteins coded for by your genome, and they are perfectly measurable in plasma. And that's, as I've told you, one thing somebody would check for fertility. The gonadal steroids feed back in a negative fashion to keep too much GnRH being released or too many gonadotropins being released. That feeding back and turning off the source of the stimulation is known as negative feedback. In this diagram, they show only estrogens acting in a negative feedback fashion. And the reason they do that is in the normal course of the ovulatory cycle, the only time negative feedback happens is in the follicular phase, where estrogens are about the only thing being produced by the follicle. But as someone brought up, birth control pills, sometimes they use progesterone, and even though it doesn't normally provide negative feedback to stop ovulation, it's close enough to estrogen that it works that way. And so that's why they don't have the red negative feedback arrow going from progestins to the negative feedback. These hormones from the ovary, estrogens, progestins, and androgens like testosterone, progesterones like progesterone, and estrogens like estradiol, they prepare the body for reproduction. So they're going to prepare the endometrium of the uterus to be ready for an embryo and implantation and maintain it. They are going to act, for example, on mammillary tissue, the breasts, to get them ready for the possibility that things are going to get gearing up for a pregnancy. They may also, the androgens, among other things, they are released much lower levels in women than in men, but they are released at the time of ovulation. And it's clear that they stimulate libido. So you can see all these things are preparing the body to get ready to reproduce, and including the brain, making the individual more receptive to the idea of having sex, right? Or more interested, at least. Questions about that? All of that? And so that brings us to this diagram of the same thing. The brain decided that an ovulatory cycle is called for. So at the end of menses, GnRH levels go up and bring follicle stimulating hormone up and luteinizing hormone up. But it's follicle stimulating hormone that's doing most of the stimulation of the follicles. And then at the peak of LH production, at that point, ovulation takes place. It prompts the ripened follicle to release an egg. And then negative feedback means these gonadotropins start plummeting again. So far, so good? Good. Sophie. The negative feedback is, notice that gonadotropin levels keep going up and up and up. So there's no negative feedback here. And then suddenly, and at this point, what the negative feedback is doing is keeping too much gonadotropins from being released. Okay. But eventually, despite that, there's a peak, and afterwards, they both decline. They're declining now because the hypothalamus says so. The hypothalamus has decided that's enough. We got the right levels. At this point, it's two things, and I'm glossing over it, right? It's certainly a negative feedback effect because, as we'll see in a moment, estrogens are high at this time too. But it's also that the hypothalamus is programmed to do that. That after it releases that pulse of GnRH that causes a pulse of LH, and it's monitoring that pulse. After it reaches a certain point, it stops. My work here is done. And if we look at here, we can see here's the estradiol. It's getting higher and higher. The negative feedback is what keeps it from going totally through the roof. So it's being kept in check, but the hypothalamus is indeed deciding to let it ramp up. And the ovary is producing very little in the way of progesterone. But now, after ovulation, as gonadotropin levels plummet, estrogen production also plummets. But now the follicle starts working on its own to release progesterone for a certain amount of time. The follicle collapses, forms a corpus luteum, and it secretes progesterone, and progesterone is going to keep rising, and it's preparing the endometrium for implantation. And if an embryo forms, one of the first things it starts doing is arranging for continued progesterone to keep it there so it can have a chance to grow. Eventually, it'll be the embryo and fetus that controls progesterone production and controls the state of the endometrium. And parturition won't happen until the embryo decides it's time. From it.
Is it the placenta cells that like the fetus kind of controls the release progesterone, or is it the actual like fetus's cells that release progesterone?
It's a great question. I'm not ready for it just yet, but it is the embryo. And at a very early stage, the embryo releases a hormone of its own that stimulates the corpus luteum to stay alive just a little bit longer. Don't leave. I know you're programmed to stop producing progesterone, but I'm here. So stick around a bit. The embryo does this because it releases its own gonadotropin, one specific gonadotropin that is only released by embryo. And it's called human chorionic gonadotropin because it mostly comes from the chorion, also known as HCG. We'll see it some more later, human chorionic gonadotropin. And if there's any HCG in circulation, you are pregnant. There is an embryo. And there's so much of this HCG being secreted think of it as the embryo saying to the corpus lutea, I'm here, honest, I'm not kidding, stick around. More progesterone, please. There's so much of it in circulation that if the woman pees on a stick that's designed to detect HCG, it will tell her there's HCG here, and that means there's an embryo. You're preggers, to use the technical term. Okay? But if there's no embryo, the corpus luteum, in the case of people, decides, nope, time's up. No embryo, no reason for me to do here. We better start over.
So here's the ovulation, estradiol decreases, and then progesterone increases. What causes that?
The cause is, so the follicle, once it collapses, its estrogen production system shuts down, and now it converts to making progesterone. Yeah. Yes.
When does the embryo start releasing HCG?
When does the embryo start releasing HCG? Within a day or two of its existence. So it's a very early indicator. And levels get up to the point where you can detect it. I forget but within a few days, the sticks that you buy in the drugstore will detect it. Good. So
6, but after almost been
6 days. Oh, I see. So you're saying that they become reliable only about a week after the period that should have come. Okay. Yeah. That sounds more like it. In other words, pretty much in the middle of the luteal phase. Yes. Because in the menstrual cycle, there's that follicular phase where estrogen is being made. And then there's the luteal phase where the luteum is producing progesterone. Right? And so this is about 2 weeks, and this is about 2 weeks. If it's a week before the period would be missed, then it's about a week into the luteal phase. Much faster than old-fashioned methods, where you had to go, if you want to know you're pregnant, you had to go to a doctor who took a blood sample, and then the blood sample was injected into a rabbit, and then they asked whether the rabbit in a few days formed a corpus luteum. Or they would look at the rabbit's ovary and see whether there was something in there. So it took days, a week. And those weren't reliable until much further along, because they weren't detecting HCG, they were detecting other stuff. Okay, one more. What's the consequence of all this for the ovary? Here you can see it. The follicle has been developing. No one knows exactly why some are further along than others, and there must be some sort of communication between the follicles, because once one follicle starts making estrogen, somehow the nearby follicles, in humans at least, where there's usually one ovulation at a time, the other nearby follicles don't. So, bless you. One follicle gets the lead, and then it stays in the lead. And as it grows, under the influence of what? What's causing the follicle to develop? What's stimulating the follicle? Follicle stimulating hormone, right? As it reaches that, and now LH shortly after gets high too, and at the peak of LH, ovulation itself is triggered. And at that point, the brain stops, the follicle stops making estrogen, and instead it's going to collapse and form the corpus luteum. And as soon as it collapses, it starts making progesterone to maintain the endometrium until long enough for an embryo, if one's coming, to implant and start making HCG to prolong the life of the corpus luteum, therefore prolong progesterone secretion, therefore increase its chances of surviving. And in the absence of that, if there is no embryo, the corpus luteum has a timing device. After a while, it stops. The cells there die, they're done, and the whole system can start over again. And here's just a look at endometrium. shed during the menstrual phase, builds up with estrogens, is maintained by progestins, and if there's no pregnancy, then they decline again as progesterone levels fall. Why are progesterone levels falling? No pregnancy, Maya? Progesterone levels are falling because the corpus luteum, it's a limited time offer, right? It's timing. Don't know how. Nobody knows how, but it's timing. After a certain amount of time, it stops. Unless it's stimulated by the corpus luteum will close up shop unless it's stimulated by HCG, which came from heaven, stork, the embryo. Yeah. Explain it to your mom. Oh, and there's when I told you testosterone's at its peak, just when you're most likely to get pregnant. When gathering sperm is a really good idea. Not necessarily the day of ovulation, but maybe a day or two before ovulation. Because the sperm will persist and they will be ready for the opportunity. And here's the sort of evidence that shows that androgen is important for libido in women. Sometimes when women undergo menopause, there are, we'll talk about it later, there are all sorts of consequences as the ovary stops producing those ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So at that point, there are lots of things that happen where those hormones are no longer stimulating the body to do things that the woman has been used to. And so sometimes women will take estrogen replacement therapy to soften the impact of the loss of estrogen from the ovaries on their bodies. And that has all sorts of positive effects. Estrogen treatment postmenopausal women, for example, helps maintain the elasticity of the vagina and helps maintain secretions from the vagina. They're important for lubrication, etc. But another thing that women will complain about is that they're having a loss of libido. And you can imagine that part of the loss of libido is, well, if lubrication is more of a problem than it used to be, maybe that's why they're not so eager to have sex, right? But that's not what the women tell us, right? And so in randomized placebo-controlled studies, some women were given very tiny doses of testosterone along with the estrogen, and those are the women who reported an increase in their libido. So we know that the increase in libido is not mediated by estrogens or progesterones. It's being mediated by testosterone. And since it's not having an effect that we can detect in the peripheral tissues, in the vagina, it's probably acting on the brain to increase libido. So in both, and we'll see when we talk about males in chapter 3, there's excellent evidence that testosterone also drives libido in men. Again, placebo-controlled studies of men who have lost their testes for one reason or another, the men always know when they're on the testosterone because they feel so much better. How's that? Okay. And here they're just putting it all together. And you can see how all this is synchronized. And again, don't memorize what these look like. Memorize what the steps are and the logic involved so that you can reconstruct it yourself. And I'll tell you before you do, I don't care if you get the details right of just when the peak is and all that stuff. I'm more concerned about you knowing the logic of it, because all these hormonal profiles, they're different in different species. And to some extent, they differ from one woman to another. But the sequence has to be the same if a pregnancy is likely going to be possible. Question. This is a great time for questions. Good. Thank you. Yeah.
The thing about testosterone, definitely makes sense because I know a lot of trans men, they do their T-shot and they're like, okay, so this is crazy, almost immediately after.
Yep. So Same too. So trans men who are taking testosterone or other androgens at the time, they report, I mean, there are lots of reports out there. For some of them, it's very distressing, right? And some of them don't just report an increased libido, also feel like that they're having more aggression, they're feeling more aggressive, etc. And typically they feel more energy than they had before. That's well in the uterus and preparing the uterus. They both have the same effect in the endometrium. So, but right, estrogen causes the endometrium to get thicker, and progesterone maintains it, and so they have a similar effect there in the endometrium. It happens that it's estrogen that's doing the work at the beginning of the cycle, in the pre-ovulatory phase or the follicular phase, and it's progesterone that's doing most of the work after the ovulation, in the post-ovulatory cycle, the luteal phase. But they're working the same way. And this is probably why they also work the same way in the brain, which is probably why progesterone is just as good as a birth control pill as estrogen. Good. Nick. What happens to the hormones? It's a great question, and I haven't touched it at all. Most hormones are broken down right away in the body. So most of them are going to get chewed up by the liver and taken apart. And that's just a natural way of things. If your body's going to release hormones, it's important they not stick around too long. Because if they stick around too long, you can't have that punctate communication to say something important's happening right now, right? And so, and of these hormones, the steroid hormones, they are chewed up extraordinarily fast. The biological half-life of a steroid that's in circulation is measured in hours. So to maintain any amount of steroid hormone in circulation, the organ has to be producing it all the time. And this is one reason why some testosterone treatment is sometimes done in patches, because if you do an injection, you'll experience a very high peak, quickly followed by a decline, and it's not necessarily easy. There are various tricks to try to maintain the peak for longer, but this is why sometimes all of steroid hormones, sometimes they're provided through patches where they slowly release the product into the bloodstream, try to keep it more steady. And it's why all those methods are inferior to the real item, because we have no idea how to mimic natural secretion of hormones. Pardon? Okay, good. Yeah, you were picturing explaining it to your mom, right? Okay. This phase of the loss of the endometrium causes menses or menstruation, and so it's not unusual for women to do things to deal with that. There are, in most societies around the world, women have some idea when the menses are going to start, and they might use some sort of external product to catch the flow, although not always. Or you can put things inside the vagina to absorb the flow before it comes out. And if various tampons and things like that, if one does that, it's important that they be changed regularly, because it is possible for infections to happen. And there have been women who, because of design flaws in tampons, have become deathly ill. And so it is important to change them once in a while. In other cases, there might be an external product, a sanitary napkin, to catch the blood flow, and that works too. Most people, including most women, overestimate how much of the menstrual flow there actually is. Having said that, of course, women vary enormously in how much there is. But in general, in the course of a menstrual period, there'll be a couple of tablespoons. That's about it, total. And if it's more than that, there might be a problem, or it might just be ordinary variation. And another way of dealing with these things are so-called cervical cups or vaginal cups. And the idea is just to keep the menstrual flow inside the vagina until you find yourself in a bathroom or something where you can reach in. And these cups are highly flexible. So you can reach into the vagina, pinch them closed again to bring them out, rinse them, wash them with soap and water, maybe add a little bit of lubricant, and put them back. And again, with these things, it's important to change them. You don't want to put in the cap and then leave it the whole menstrual period. And, here's another version where you see there's this little handle meant to make it easier to pull it out when you're ready for that. And there. Questions about that? In our society and many societies, but not all societies, a woman's menstrual flow is considered taboo, considered bad, unhealthful, things like that. And medically, scientifically, there's just nothing to that. There's nothing. It's totally safe. It's not. There's an idea of avoiding intercourse when a woman's having her menstrual period. And if she doesn't feel like having intercourse, then that's fine. But there's no reason not to have sex during that period. And no harm comes to anyone. It's nothing toxic in it. And yet, lots of cultures, including most of those that gave rise to American culture, consider the woman somewhat suspect when she's having her period. And in some societies, women, when they're having their period, they're required to live with, outside the rest of the group. And you might speculate sometime about why it is that, what would be behind this considering menstrual flow to be somehow nasty or something shameful, or to be kept a secret, or to be kept away from other people. I don't know of any risk involved in being exposed to menstrual flow. And I don't know if it's still true. There was a time there in maybe the second or third wave of feminism when it was like a rite of passage. Each woman had to deliberately taste their menstrual flow, to demonstrate to themselves and to the world that there's nothing wrong with it. And it was totally safe to do. So there's nothing. Yeah. And likewise, if a partner wants to perform cunnilingus where they're stimulating the vulva with their mouth and tongue, there's no risk if the woman happens to be menstruating. No risk involved at all. I mean, beyond sexually transmitted infections that have nothing to do with menstrual flow. Okay. Oh, and there is a growing movement of people that say, well, just let it flow. All right. My clothes are totally washable. You know what you're doing. You can get it to wash out. And so why make it something shameful? Okay. Yeah. You can read more about that if you like. So here's the ovulatory cycle seen again in the traditional cycle form, where the total number of days tends to be about 28 days. By convention, we start numbering the cycle at the beginning of the first day of menses, first day of the menstrual flow. And on average, it comes out to about 28 days. So there will be 4 to 5, maybe 6 days of menstrual flow. And then about 2 weeks after day 1 is when ovulation tends to take place, no guarantee. And we call that phase between the end of menses and the beginning and ovulation, that's known as the what phase? Pre-ovulatory, but what's the other? Follicular. Why? Because the follicles are growing. And, right? And then after ovulation, it's called the post-ovulatory phase, but it's also called the luteal phase, because that's when the corpus luteum is formed, and now progesterone is predominating. And if there's no Oh, of course. Sorry. I wanted you to think of it without reading it. Anyway, and if there's no embryo, then in spontaneous ovulators like humans and most of the mammals, then the cycle starts all over again. And I touched on this before, but in general, if let's see, in women as they get older, there will come a time when the ovulatory cycle first becomes more irregular than it had been before, and there might be phases where they skip a cycle doesn't happen, or two, and then the time between ovulatory cycles, which they can keep track of in terms of menstruation, the time might get more variable, further apart, and eventually will stop altogether. And that too is a decision that the brain has made. There's still plenty of follicles left, right? Plenty of oocytes, thousands of them left. But the brain stops releasing GnRH in the right cycle to let the anterior pituitary release gonadotropins in the right cycle for the cycle to start over again. This period is known as menopause. Oh, well, technically, anytime you stop having your period, that's amenorrhea. And sometimes there's a problem where amenorrhea happens in someone who's not very old. And that's worth going to the doctor and talking about, right? About what's going on. Yeah. I mean, in general, if it's a woman of a certain age, that will be referred to as menopause. And, the cause is understood. If it's happening in a young woman, especially if she's had periods before, then there's a reason to be concerned. And if she's pretty sure she's not pregnant, HCGs missing, etc., then it might be worth looking into, especially if she thinks she's going to want to have children someday, right? She's concerned about fertility. Good. Is there a term that refers to yeah, so you'll hear people talk about perimenopausal, PERI, menopausal, around the time of menopause. And, nobody gets a postcard saying menopause has begun for you, right? It's a process. Stephanie? Uh-huh. I mean, so it might be that a period gets skipped, and sometimes that happens. Some women's periods are more unusual, more variable than others. But if it's not someone who is in menopause, and if they know they're not pregnant, and it would probably be worth, if you skip more than one ovulatory cycle, it would probably be worth looking into, going to a doctor about. Yeah, and then yeah. At any phase, of course, you can go to a doctor and start estrogen treatment. And there's been something of a sea change. I don't know that I'll talk about this a lot, but there was a time when hormonal replacement therapy, HRT, was very common. And then back at the end of the 20th century, there was a big study that suggested that HRT might increase risk of certain cancers, like cervical cancer, ovarian cancer, breast cancer, etc. And and so for a while, that stopped. My understanding is that current recommendations are that if a woman is going to have hormone replacement therapy, she begins early after menopause. It seems like the biggest risk is when they've gone through a long period of time when they haven't seen ovarian steroids. And now when they start taking ovarian steroids, there are more side effects and fewer benefits. So it's sort of unfortunate, but if you're going to make the decision, my understanding is the current recommendation is if you're going to do it, you want to avoid having long periods where there's been no ovarian steroids. But as with any medical treatment, it comes with risks. Other things that can stop amenorrhea, we'll talk about contraceptive pills, that's on purpose, certain drugs, stress. So if a woman's feeling especially stressed, That could be a time when the brain says, you know what, this is not the time to get pregnant. Let's just take a pause. And likewise, one consequence of stress is weight loss. And it is clear that women with eating disorders, where they lose a lot of body weight, one of the things that will happen eventually is once they've lost a certain amount of body weight, menses may stop. Other things that can cause amenorrhea are sometimes excessive exercise, or women athletes who take testosterone. We'll explain why in a moment. If they're taking testosterone, that can act just like a birth control pill and stop ovulation. So all of those could be understood as the brain deciding whether it's a good idea to reproduce or not. Question? Anyone? Great questions. I'm concerned about getting through this material today, and so we're going to skip one Kahoot, but if we have time, we will have another one, all right? So, but this is a great time to ask questions about any of this material so far. Okay. Oh, good. Yeah. Can stress also accelerate menopause? Yeah, there's pretty good evidence of that too. And another thing that stress does, we'll talk about as we talk about puberty, that's pretty well documented, is that girls who haven't had their first period yet, if they're living in stressful conditions, they're more likely to have their first menopause earlier in life. So something about stress causes, yeah. Okay, let's talk some more about what all these hormones are doing. One of the things that ovarian steroids do is to increase the interest in having sex. And so people have tried to understand what is happening as women are becoming aroused. And it's clear we won't have a lot to say about what causes women to become sexually aroused. We know testosterone can help, but mostly it's to do with all sorts of psychological factors that we will talk about later, but aren't a topic here. And one way you can measure sexual arousal is by paying attention to genitalia. We've already talked about how during sexual arousal, the clitoris will become engorged, right? Because of vasocongestion, will get larger and more sensitive, because as it expands, that makes those touch receptors, I'll show you some in a moment, that much more sensitive to touch. And that sexual arousal also causes the vagina to secrete more of the slippery stuff that acts as a lubricant. And what some researchers have done have put this device inside a woman's vagina, with her permission, of course, while she is sexually aroused and or masturbating. And one of the things that happens as she becomes sexually aroused is blood flow to the interior of the vagina, the endometrium, increases. So it becomes more, I suppose, a little thicker, but also becomes more engorged, is releasing more, filtering out more slippery stuff, more lubrication, and things like that. So, questions about that? Yeah. That thing is a plethysmograph, optical plethysmograph, and I don't have that time. And so you put it in the vagina, it has an LED that shines the light that's going to be reflected off the walls of the vagina. And then it has a photodetector that detects the spectrum of light that's being reflected. And as the vagina becomes more engorged with blood, it becomes redder, and it can detect that. So it's just a way of keeping track of the state of the endometrium. Yeah. What about dilation? Well, the dilation means the blood vessels are getting larger, letting more blood flow through, and therefore it looks redder. Just like when, you've been out in the sun. No. Just like when you're embarrassed and someone's face turns red, if you're someone that has that happen, that's because the blood vessels have gotten bigger and more blood's flowing through there. And it's also feeling warmer. Pardon? Oh, well, yeah, that's not what I was saying, and therefore not what I thought. but but I'll bet it's right because I wrote it up there. Okay. Well, thank you, Nick. So, hmm. Well, the vaginal walls change the blood flow, and you can detect that with light. That's what I know for sure. And yeah, and when we look at erection of either the clitoris or the penis, what we're going to see is it's an important mixture of opening up some blood vessels and closing off others. And so, yeah, we'll see. You'll see. We'll get there. The other thing I have to talk about is the so-called Grafenberg spot or the G spot. Um, this is something of a controversy. For some women, it is clear that stimulation of this portion of the vagina makes it easier for them to reach orgasm or to have a more intense orgasm. And it's named after a doctor who first described it. And it's one of those situations where lots of women were saying, "Oh, this is real," and lots of men who were most of the doctors this time said, "Oh, you're making it up, right? You're imagining." And so, but when enough women report this, you have to think that it's true. And so I think I think it's now widely accepted that there is such a spot and that it's important for some women, but it's not important for all women. Right. And one of the things I think that made the doctors somewhat skeptical of this is, in fact, in normal intercourse, it's not easy to stimulate the G spot because of where it is. So to find the G spot, it's in a very particular location that is in the vagina. It's in that portion, it's behind the portion in the middle of the vaginal shaft. It's in that portion that is facing the pubic symphysis, right? So facing up. Here's the woman's belly, here's her back. So it's on that surface, that area of the middle of the vagina for most women. And you can see how putting a penis in there or a dildo won't necessarily stimulate it very thoroughly. In fact, the best way for most women to stimulate the G spot is with fingers, right? And so, I think it's not easy to know what function it could serve, but it's clear that for many women, it is an enhancement. I don't know that there are any women who fail to reach orgasm without stimulation of the G spot. So it's not like the clitoris in that regard. Most women will not reach orgasm without some stimulation of the clitoris. But for some women, it's felt to be very helpful to have the G spot stimulated. And one possible explanation for this is anatomically, there is this gland called Skene's gland that's in this area that is somewhat embryologically homologous to the prostate of men. And there are lots of men that feel like massage of the prostate during orgasm is, first of all, that massage of the prostate is pleasurable, and that massage of the prostate can enhance orgasm. And again, but of course, the only way to massage the prostate in men is to put something inside the anus. And so, again, it's not easy to see what this has to do with reproduction. And so it may not serve a function. It may just be a consequence of other aspects of the developing body and a sort of a coincidence. And for those people that enjoy having their G-spot or prostate massaged, it's a happy coincidence. Right? But in neither case are they typically stimulated during penile vaginal intercourse.
State and grandma, how does that work? Is it more psychological or is it?
Yeah, so for men, typically if they derive pleasure from something in the anus, it's because it's pushing against the front, rubbing because that's where the prostate is, as we'll see next week. And your point is, but women don't have a prostate, so why? But the suggestion is Skeen's gland may be embryologically homologous to the prostate, and that's why some women get pleasure there from that. So no one's suggesting this serves a biological function, but psychologically it clearly works for a lot of people. Yeah. And there's the way to stimulate it. When we talk about sexual positions later, this is one of the few areas where stimulation might be better for the G-spot if with a rear entry into the vagina, because then the penis or dildo is sort of pointing at the right part of the vaginal wall. Okay. Another thing that we want to talk about, something you've heard about, are so-called pap smears. The pap doesn't stand for anything. It's short for the Greek-American physician who came up with it, Papanakolaou. And so you're glad they just call it the pap test. And the pap test is one where a doctor would put in a speculum to get access to the cervix and then use some sort of swab to take a sample of the cervix and then send off that sample for a pathology report where people would look for possible precancerous growth. And cervical cancer is one of the leading causes of cancer in women. And so it's very common. And so it used to be suggested that women receive a pap smear every year in order to detect cervical cancer early, because then you had the best chance of stopping it from killing. And often the response would be removal of the cervix as part of a hysterectomy, removing of the entire uterus, but which has its consequences, but it's better than dying. So cervical cancer is a very serious risk. Recommendations about how often to get cervical cancer have changed some for several reasons. One is the tests have gotten better. And the other is that most precancerous lesions in the cervix are caused by a virus. The virus is one that can be spread through intercourse, but not only through intercourse. It's a common virus, and it infects some of the cells of the cervix and causes them to start dividing improperly, and sometimes can kick them down a pathway of division that will lead to cancer. And sometimes those cancers can then metastasize and start infecting other parts of the body. And when that happens, you're doomed, right? So if one didn't get infected with HPV, it turns out that nearly every cervical cancer begins with infection with the human papillomavirus. And one of the things that's happened for your generation is that there's now a vaccine that keeps people from being infected with HPV. It's known as Gardasil. It is, as we are in this next phase of anti-vax craziness, even before RFK, there was lots of controversy about Gardasil, and all of it, the risks were made out of whole cloth. It's not true. So here I've put up for you what's happened, what people have seen. And I need to point out to you that anytime you give any treatment to a large population, think about this for a moment. If you give any treatment to millions of people, you know what? Some of them are going to die. Wait a minute. If you pick millions of people at random, some of them are going to die, right? And so the tricky thing is to say, well, of those that got the HPV vaccine, is there a higher rate of death among those than among a control group? Also, not necessarily easy. But here you can see of the possible side effects that have been reported, which are basically, and I'm sure these are true, right? These side effects are true. They happen with all vaccines. There will be a proportion of the population that will have these reactions, right? Always. But they are, as you can see, transient. And they're much more transient than, dying, much more transient than cancer. So of this case, right, 67 million doses were given. And of course, the death rate in that group is going to be fairly low because these were young people, right? And so you look at that, and 25,000 reported some adverse event. And 25,000 sounds like a lot of people, except you got to remember it's 67 million people, right? So it's less than 1 in 1,000. And these are the reports. Of those 67 million people, 47 of them died. And when that happens, of course, you look at those deaths and you try to determine, if the person was in a car accident, okay, you can't blame that on the vaccine, right? If the person, if something else happened to them, you can't, anyway, so it's happened. So it is one of the safest vaccines that has ever been produced. And it has already saved millions of lives from cervical cancer, because people who have the vaccine, their chance of getting any sort of cervical cancer, it doesn't stop against all HPVs, just most of them. And we already know that it's saved millions of women from dying of cervical cancer. And as far as we can tell, it's never killed anybody. And again, as far as we can tell, the only side effects have been a few days of discomfort. When the vaccine was originally produced, the CDC, in a move that drove me crazy, was recommending it only for girls, preferably girls who have not yet had sexual intercourse, because if they already had sexual intercourse and been infected with HPV, the vaccine wouldn't protect them, right? But why only girls? Where does HPV come from? Well, typically from sex. And guys have HPV too, right? So it took like a couple of years for people to wake up and say, wait a minute. Are you trying to stop cervical cancers or not? And so if you are, then both sexes should get vaccinated, preferably before they become sexually active. And the death rates of cervical cancer have plummeted. It's been one of the most life-saving medical interventions that anyone's ever come up with. Question. It's a fairly complicated vaccine. You have to get a couple of doses, but hopefully all of you got it. And, if you have a son and you decided, I don't want my son to get the vaccine because he's never going to get cervical cancer. Well, wait a minute. If your son has a partner someday, you're not willing to let your son risk a headache to save her life? That's kind of a dick move.
Vaccine. So then it's one of them.
No, this is not given to babies. Nope. So for it to be most effective, it's given to children, yes, underage children, but you want to try to catch them before they've had a chance to be sexually active. So that's the rationale. And anti-Gardasil feeling has been especially high in Hispanic and Black populations in the United States. And they are the ones that have traditionally had more cases of cervical cancer, and they're the ones that are getting less of the benefit of it. So in my high school, Southern Missouri, it is really depressing to go to reunions. And there are so many of my Black female classmates who are gone from cervical cancer. It's really shocking. And that's that cohort, but there's no reason for this to happen in your cohort.
They're wrong, but why are Hispanic and Black people not getting off the vaccine?
Well, there's more anti-vax sentiment. That's one reason. The other is, of course, access to medicine and the medical treatment. Yeah.
Because back in the day was when ethics boards and all of that were in, or people weren't as keen to follow like to the Tuskegee experiment there through generations. It's been passed down for kind of a good reason, like back in the day, to be kind of like wary of like doctors and medical establishment.
It is indisputable that minority populations have been subjected to more unethical behavior on the part of scientists. And so that's a perfectly valid reason to be suspicious of what they say next. Totally. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Tuskegee incident. There's lots of others. When we talk about birth control pills and how it was worked out, what the real side effects are, as opposed to the perceived side effects, you wouldn't believe this. But someone did a placebo-controlled, double-blind study of women who either were put on the birth control pill or were put on a placebo. And lo and behold, there were some differences in some of the reported after effects. Now, does that, wait, you mean so some women were told they were given a birth control pill and they weren't? What ethics board approved that? Well, guess what? That study was done at a clinic in the Southwest of the United States that served almost exclusively Hispanic population. Early 60s. So there's no denying that that's another reason why minority groups have every reason to be suspicious. Okay. Other things that can go wrong. There are times when the endometrium or other parts of the uterus where tissues grow abnormally and form these things that are known as fibroids. They're called that because they look like they're made up of fibers. And they are, for the most part, benign. That is, they're not cancerous for the most part. But of course, they can still cause discomfort and can still interfere with fertility. And so it's one of the things that people, that OBGYNs can be on the lookout for. Sometimes they can be palpated from outside through the abdominal wall and things like that. And sometimes they cause more painful menses and or irregular menstruation, things like that. Questions about any of that? How many of you know someone who has been told by a doctor that they have fibroids? Yeah, very common, right? Not life-threatening, but worth looking into and keeping track of. Next, let's talk about another sexually selected characteristic, these external breasts of women. And but I suppose now we're done talking about the fact that they're more externalized than other species. Their role, of course, is to nurture the young. So breasts, technically they're known as mammary gland, and that refers to nursing and breasts, and that's why mammals are called mammals, because they all have mammary glands. And each breast in humans, breasts are composed primarily of fat and fatty tissue. And we'll take a look at them in a moment. So each breast consists of a dozen or 20 different lobules of fatty tissue and, lobes. And each of those lobes consists of lobules. And each lobule has within it a tiny little cavity. And so when the breast is lactating, when it's producing milk, each one of those little cavities is going to secrete out, circulating from the blood and from cells there that are adding constituents to it, is going to secrete out a little bit of milk. And so when the breasts eject milk, and sometimes it can be an ejection, it's the result of thousands of these tiny little bulbs, each making a little bit of milk and getting squeezed to push the milk out. So we call each one of those cavities, they're an alveola. You run into alveoli before in the lungs. Each one of those little roughly spherical containers may be referred to as an alveolus, and there's several of them, they're alveoli. And within each alveolus, it has a central opening part. Remember, we always call that the lumen in anatomy. And the lumen is lined with these cells. They're going to produce products to be added to make up the milk. And so they're the ones that are making the milk itself. It's a glandular secretion of, bless you, the cells that are lining lumen in the breast. Then each one of these lumen, right, if it's making the milk and it just sits there, that doesn't feed anybody. And so for the system to work, each lumen has to have around it a layer of muscle that when it contracts will squeeze the lumen, make it smaller, and push the milk out. Just like the uterus has to have a myometrial layer, right, to squeeze out the fetus and send it out. So, thought I had a chart. Yeah, let's do this first. So here are these various lobes, and you can see each one is made up of lobules. And if we take a look, and they all have ductwork that's eventually going to lead to several openings in the nipple. And each one of these hundreds of lobules has within it a little lumen where the milk secreting cells line the lumen, and they're surrounded by muscle cells that can contract, squeeze the lumen, make it smaller, and the milk's got nowhere to go but out the duct. And as hundreds, thousands of these ducts come together, they come to larger ducts that are closer to the nipple, and eventually they'll be squeezed out into the infant's mouth. How's that? And of course, until late 19th century, early 20th century, this is how every human on Earth lived beyond infancy, was to be nursed. What else do I need to say? Oh, and we can call these various openings lactiferous sinuses. The sinus is just an opening, right? Up there in your back of your nose, the sinus is referring to the open space in there. Yeah. Questions about that? Okay. You got to decide what. The point here is that all breasts are different. There is no right structure, no wrong structure. There's highly variable, and they're all perfectly normal. Sometimes people are concerned about whether the breasts are asymmetrical or not, and more often than not, they're not quite perfectly symmetrical. And again, that's no functional significance whatsoever. Small breasts can produce just as much milk as big breasts, so breast size has nothing to do with milk production, unrelated. And to the extent that they're larger, that just means they have more fat in them. And that, having fat has consequences for general nutrition and body physiology, but it has no consequence for the amount of milk produced or the quality of milk that's produced or anything like that. Yeah. And recommendations are changing, but a common cancer in women is breast cancer. And recommendations are changing quite a bit, but I haven't seen anyone suggest that there's anything wrong with having breast examinations where you put yourself in a quiet place where you can concentrate and where you take your fingers and try to feel the breasts, and you're going to find irregularities there. You're going to find, some places that seem a little bit harder than others, et cetera. And at your age, that's probably not a reason to be too upset. But the point of these examinations is then to notice if there's any change in the composition or the feel of the breasts. This so-called breast self-examination is notoriously unreliable, and therefore you may or may not feel like it's worth trying. Recommendations change. But at a certain point in life, the recommendations are going to be clear for women. As you get older, your chances of breast cancer increase. And so there's suggestions of mammograms where there is ways of visualizing the interior where you might be able to catch a tumor at an early enough stage that it can be surgically removed before it has metastasized and possibly killed you. These scans have gotten better and better, more and more accurate. I think what's going to happen next is they're going to have a huge increase in accuracy. And by accuracy, I mean detecting tumors that are there and not alerting you to tumors that aren't there. And it's probably about to become much better because of machine learning algorithms and things like that. But I've never heard anyone who's had one who said it wasn't really uncomfortable. It hurts. How many of you know someone who's had a mammogram and reported that it was really uncomfortable? Yeah, that's just how it goes. That's part and parcel of it and has to be done. And but it beats dying. So I'm gonna. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Is there any correlation? Breast size, age?
That's a great question. As far as I know, there's no correlation between breast size and breast cancer rate. And I guess the other, removing a breast, either because there's a tumor there or in some cases, Angelina Jolie is a famous actress who had a high genetic risk for breast cancer. And so she had hers removed before there was any cancer developed there. And as she pointed out, prosthetic breasts are perfectly accessible, at least if you have as much money as movie stars do. But I thought it was pretty brave of her to tell the world that, those breasts she has now are manufactured or the result of cosmetic surgery. I guess and there's growing awareness of people trying to get rid of the shame of having mastectomy, right? Here, I'm just trying to point out to you that breast cancer is an important cause of death in women, but it's nowhere near the most common cause. It's not even the most common cancer that kills women. Most common cancer to kill women is lung cancer. And fortunately or unfortunately, the proportion of young people who smoke, that proportion that are female, has been going up in recent years. And the one thing we know is that smoking increases the risk of lung cancer, also stroke, chronic lung disease, and heart disease. And heart disease is far and away the most common medical cause of death in women, as it is in men. All of which is just to put cancer risk in perspective, but is no reason not to get mammograms or to be alert to that. The last thing, and this is the thing I very much want to get to, is to tell you about lactation. So when a woman is given birth to a child, immediately after birth, lots of the hormones of pregnancy have been preparing her breasts for lactation. But immediately after birth, little or no milk will be produced. Sometimes it will produce some thin sort of liquid known as colostrum, but it's of no nutritive value. But it's vital that the infant suckle at the breast anyway, because what's going to control lactation from this point on is the physical sensation of suckling at the breast. So this is a so-called milk letdown reflex that is very well understood, and it's a great example of how the nervous system and hormones can interact with one another and how they have to interact with one another. When the infant, when a mother knows her infant is ready to feed, she puts the child on the breast. The child comes out of the womb ready to latch on to the breast and start suckling it in a rhythmic fashion. And this sensory stimulation, the sensation of suckling at the breast, reaches the brain, and there it triggers lactation. So the nerve impulses get to the brain, first in somatosensory cortex, places like that, but eventually it funnels to the hypothalamus, and then it will be the hypothalamus that will decide to get milk flowing. The increased activity there causes neurons in the hypothalamus to fire and release a hormone. These neurons are reaching a different part of the pituitary than the anterior pituitary, where the gonadotropins come from. These neurons have their cell bodies in the hypothalamus, but their axons reach the posterior pituitary. Totally anatomically, embryologically different part of the pituitary. And these neurons make a hormone called oxytocin. These neurons have synapses like all other neurons. And so when they're stimulated enough, they fire rhythmically and release oxytocin. Their axons release the oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. It's the oxytocin that goes to the mammary glands, and it causes the myometrium and all those lumen to contract. So they're being driven to contract not by nerve impulses, but by hormone. So the posterior pituitary releases a wave of oxytocin, which then acts on the breast to squeeze the milk out as the baby is suckling.
Since oxytocin is also produced during like sexual activity, stuff like that, could that trigger lactation in someone who is already lactating?
Yes, and it does. So what Maya is telling you that I haven't told you yet is in both sexes, there's also a release of oxytocin at orgasm, right? But let's save that for sex, because I want to tell you so as long as the woman continues to have an infant nurse, she will continue to produce milk. The breast will continue to produce milk because her brain will continue to stimulate the breast to produce milk. And so if the infant nurses until it's 5 years old, 6 years old, as long as it's nursing regularly, she'll continue to produce milk. And as soon as it stops nursing regularly, eventually she will stop producing the milk. So it sometimes happens before bottles were around and safe, that some people would pay a woman to nurse their child for them. And such a woman was called a wet nurse, right? Where she had been pregnant at some point and she produced milk, and eventually she stopped giving milk to her infant, but as long as someone continued to suckle at her breast, she would continue to produce it. The other thing that's interesting about the milk letdown reflex is that most women, when the oxytocin is released in a wave, they can feel it. And their sensation is suddenly the milk's flowing. And it tends to happen only if they're feeling pretty relaxed. And eventually, this release of oxytocin can become uncoupled from the suckle, where for some women, hearing their child cry out for milk will cause a release of oxytocin, and therefore milk will come out of their breasts. And so they might wear a bra with pads to catch any unexpected release of milk like that. And so here's a beautiful system of neural and hormonal interaction where the infant starts the process, and eventually the mother comes to recognize the cry and will, through classical conditioning, start releasing hormone. And sometimes a mother might be in public and hear somebody else's baby cry, and it might cause a release. Yeah. Okay. Sorry to hold you over. No, it's 4 o'clock precisely. Right. Thanks.